All right. Okay, so Julian, you're up next.
Okay, here we go. So I grew up in Oklahoma, and this is one of my favorite places, and not just in Oklahoma, but in the world. This is the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge. And it's a beautiful place, as you can see. It has bison, it has other wildlife, it has great wildflowers and pollinators. And there's a place there where I'd like to go, where after driving for a couple hours to get there and hiking for a couple of hours, I could climb up to the top of one of these rocky hills that they call mountains, and look all around and not see any signs of people, not see any roads or power lines. And I'd like to imagine what the expanse of the Great Plains might have looked like before settlers arrived. And so this was something that was really special to me, because places like that are rare in Oklahoma and are rare in the world. There aren't very many wilderness places we're lucky here in Colorado to have a lot of places like that. So I became interested in studying the impacts of people on landscapes, things like habitat fragmentation, and how we can mitigate those effects on biodiversity and make the most of what remains. For example, with things like corridors. And like I mentioned, this is not just the case in Oklahoma. Human impacts are evident all over the world. Agriculture covers 38% of land on Earth, and this has come at a high cost of biomes around the world. 70% of grasslands, 50% of savannas, about a third of forests have been converted. And under habitat loss like this, we often have resulting fragmentation, where patches become smaller and more isolated, more affected by edges. And of course, we also have impacts of climate change that are becoming more and more evident. And you heard a lot about that work from Dr. Inouye's talk just now. And then we also have invasive species that can have a lot of impacts. And so I'm most motivated in research questions that are at this interface of basic and applied ecology. So the unifying theme of the research in my lab is to understand how changes in the environment affect biodiversity, to better inform how we might be able to mitigate some of those effects. So I'm interested in things like habitat loss and fragmentation, climate change, species invasions, and combinations of these drivers. And to address questions in our research, we do field studies, often at large scales or long temporal scales. And we like to ground our research in ecological theory and natural history. So these are some of the things that I study, things like how corridors affect biodiversity, how fragmentation affects food webs and species niches. And in particular today, I'm going to talk about how plant-pollinator interactions change over time and space. And so we can consider a plant-pollinator interaction between, say, a bee and this flower here. But while this interaction is going on, it happens within a context of a diverse community and lots of other interactions going on. And so these networks, these species interaction networks, can be regarded as the blueprints of the architecture of biodiversity. So they depict these complex webs of interactions among species. And a useful way to visualize these networks is in a nested matrix organization, where we have the plants sorted top to bottom by generalization, with the most generalized species on top, and at the same time having the pollinators sorted left to right by generalization, such that we have interactions packed into this top left corner, which represents the most densely connected part of the network of generalists interacting with generalists. And I'll call this the core of the nested network. And plant pollinator networks typically have this nested organizations, where we see these generalists that interact with other generalists. And when we have specialists, they tend to interact with generalists. And specialists interacting with specialists do happen sometimes, but they're more uncommon. And so this nested organization is thought to be really important. The structure is supposed to be thought to be really important for the stability of these systems and making them robust to the loss of species. Now, interaction networks are typically represented and analyzed as observations that are aggregated over space or time, but explicitly looking at the temporal or spatial dimensions of these networks can increase our understanding of the ecological processes that shape them and their stability in the face of anthropogenic change. And so this can be important, for example, because the decisions we make about what scale to aggregate our data and creating these networks can have some really important consequences on the inferences we make about these network structures. So things like nestedness that I mentioned. And because interactions among species are dynamic in space and time at various characteristic scales corresponding to different processes. So it's important to consider these dynamics and to study these processes at the appropriate scales. So in recent years, there's been increased interest in the temporal and spatial aspects of species interaction networks, and a consistent pattern emerging from these studies are that most interactions are highly dynamic, with few persistently being observed over time and space. So for example, in this Eisen et al. Paper, they observed few plant-pollinator interactions consistently through these isolated hilltops, whereas in this paper by Chekov et al., we observed few interactions consistently across 6 years of study. So in both of these studies, the interactions that occurred persistently across time or space tended to involve generalist species at the core of the nested network, so the most densely connected part of the network. And so understanding how interactions persist across time and space at multiple scales is really important for understanding the dynamics of these networks and for prioritizing the conservation of species that contribute to community robustness. So I'm interested in which interactions persist. So conceivably, species tolerances to environmental conditions across space and time could affect how generalized they are, and which would affect their network position. So for example, if we consider a pollinator species, this is just made up here, like a bee here that persists when the snow melts and across the whole season, and it's active throughout the whole season. This species is going to have the opportunity to interact with a whole lot more species that are flowering throughout the season than, say, a pollinator that has a very short activity period or phenophase. And these environmental filters, in terms of environmental conditions, can be manifested over either time, like I showed, or space. And so, interested in these questions, I've been collecting data on plant-pollinator interactions throughout the flowering season for 6 years now across these 6 plots in a subalpine meadow here in the Colorado Rocky Mountains at the University of Colorado's Mountain Research Station, which is at about 9,777 feet. And so for the last 6 years, I've gone through and I've sampled plant-pollinator interactions in these long rectangular plots, doing these 15-minute surveys in which I carefully observe all flowers for visitors by walking the periphery of these plots, so I don't trample the flowers. And when I observe a pollinator contacting the reproductive structures of a flower, I record the identity of the plant and the pollinator. Pollinator usually I catch, and with the help of experts like Adrian here, get them identified and build networks so we can understand better which species and which interactions are persisting through time. And so my hypotheses for this work has been that that species tolerances to environmental conditions over time and space would determine interaction persistence by regulating temporal and spatial overlap with partner species. So I predicted that interactions with higher temporal or spatial persistence, so that's interactions that have longer phenophases, higher interannual persistence, or occur more broadly or more widespread, should occur at the core of this nested network. And so these figures here show that temporal and spatial variation, that things like temperature vary over space and time, both within and among seasons and among these plots. So to test the relationship between network position of interactions and their temporal or spatial persistence, let me just shut my door for a minute because there's noise. Excuse me. So I looked at how persistence in time or space affected network position by just simply considering the nested network and then the distance to that top left corner, giving each cell value a value of 1, and then just calculating Euclidean distance. So this example here, the values could represent the number of years in which an interaction occurred, and the patterns show reflect those of the prediction from the hypothesis of having higher persistence in the network core, reflected by those hotter colors. And so this is what we see. When I initially started working out there, I said, great, I'll work in the subalpine. There won't be that many species, but there are hundreds of species of pollinators and dozens of species of plants that have been represented in this network. And consistent with the predictions, I found that interactions between generalists show higher temporal and spatial persistence. So interactions in the core of the nested network tend to have higher interannual persistence, higher intraannual persistence, so they have longer phenophases, and higher interplot persistence. They tend to be more widespread. And so, and temporal and spatial interaction persistence values are interrelated. So interactions with higher interannual persistence tended to have longer phenophases and be more widespread among plots. And interactions with longer phenophases tended to be more widespread among plots. And at the species level, longer phenophases and higher plot occurrence and interannual persistence were associated with generalization. So that is the degree or the number of partner species. So for both plants and pollinators, species that had higher interannual persistence were closer to the core of the nested network. Species with longer phenophases were closest to the core of the nested network, and species that were more widespread among plots were in that core of the nested network. And so in summary, I found that interactions involving generalists, plants, and pollinators are more persistent in space and time. And these patterns suggest that that tolerance to environmental variation across space and time is associated with interaction generality or generalization through increased spatiotemporal overlap of interacting partners. Our study has important implications for ecology and conservation. So first, the study conceptually and empirically links persistence of interactions in time and space with tolerances of environmental conditions as a proposed mechanism linking them. And the connection between spatiotemporal distributions and specialization also relates to disparate concepts of the ecological niche that emphasize environmental constraints, which we think of as relating to the Grinnellian niche, and the role of community via interactions, or what we call the Eltonian niche. And last, and more relevant to conservation and management, These generalist species are the linchpins of networks. So you could think that if we of the cascading effects, if we lose some of these generalist species, so their presence promotes network robustness to environmental perturbations. But in spite of their pivotal role, sometimes common and generalist species are often taken for granted or not made priorities for in conservation efforts that may be more conventionally aimed at rare species. But we know that abundant and generalized species may still be susceptible to declines and extinctions in the face of environmental change. And so the possibility of these declines can puts in jeopardy the stability of these communities. So conservation priorities shouldn't overlook the pivotal roles that these generalist species play for supporting biodiversity across time and space. Now, currently, I don't have any results to show from this because this is work that's just getting off the ground. But I'm excited about working on this project where we're studying changes in a plant-pollinator network over the scale of a century. So for the last couple of years, we've been resampling a study by Frederick Clements and his student and protege, Francis Long, on Pikes Peak. And we want to use these data to understand how things like climate change and potential insect declines, which Dr. Inoue just mentioned, have changed this community. Okay, so that's what I have for you all. And if there's time, there's questions, or otherwise I can chat later, or feel free to shoot me an email.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Julian. Really cool stuff there. Just one quick question. The focus on the importance of like common and generalist species within the network. It's pretty new, right? Most people are concerned with rare, right, species. And so, from a network perspective, do you think there's something to be said about looking towards those common and generalist species in terms of determining the resiliency of a community? Whereas those rare interactions or those really specialized species may be more indicative of things that should be of conservation concern. Any thoughts?
Yeah, those things are really important to consider and always tough. It depends on values and it depends on trade-offs. There could be something to be said for focusing on rare things if they're going to be extinct. And once they're extinct, they can never come back. And so, there's certainly a place for focusing on the rare stuff. I think that it's important to think about sort of I think that's why monitoring is so important, because I think a lot of times when things are common, we assume they're okay. We see them often, we don't worry about them. A lot of times when we don't keep track of these things, we might not notice that even though they're common, they could be declining over really over scales that we might not perceive. And so that going back to some of the themes of Dr. Inoue's talk, these supporting these long-term studies and doing these long-term studies and monitoring is so important for those reasons.
Awesome. Okay, awesome. So as with Dr. Inoue, we can take some more questions in the breakout sessions if you want.